Hi, this is James Tanner. Once again, we're here for a Sunday afternoon class from the BYU Library Family History Center in Provo, Utah. And this topic that we're going to talk about, my kind of interest in, other than the general background interest that I have in all things genealogical, became more focused when my wife and I were serving as church service missionaries for the Church Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as missionaries to digitizing records for family search. And we were stationed at the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis, Maryland. And the records we were assigned to digitize were in the form of these gigantic books, like 2 feet by 3 feet and weighing about 40 pounds, a lot of them. And they turned out to be probate records almost consistently all the way through. We did probate records or any records that were associated with probates. And one of the things that showed up in those records, because they were the orphan court records for Maryland, which is a name that came because of the fact that children of a deceased family, let's say a husband and wife, the husband dies, the children at that time became orphans. Even though the wife was still alive, they weren't considered to be a family anymore, and they were orphans. And the wife only had limited capability of taking over the guardianship or of the surviving children. And in this case, one of the things that happened also was the probate files. And the probate files have lots and lots of documents. But the main documents, a couple of the main documents consist of an inventory of the estate upon the death of the person, and then an assessment of the value of the estate. And the value was placed sort of arbitrarily on. And one of the things that showed up in these documents were indentures and enslaved people because they were both considered to be property. In addition, the records we were doing were shortly after the Civil War, some of them, and many of those documents became indenture documents. In other words, they were in the probate court, but they were indenture documents, meaning they were the contracts, they were copies of the contracts at which a person who was, for whatever reason, placed into an indenture. And one of the things that seemed very consistent was that enslaved people at the end of the Civil War, when they were freed from slavery, according to the national law, were simply, in a lot of cases, put into indentures, which was not as serious as an inheritable enslavement that was the existence, but it was still a different kind of restriction on a person's life for a period of years. And they were enforceable and they were legal and they were actually transferable. And we'll talk a whole bit about that. But that's kind of the introduction to what happened to turn my attention towards indentures. And the indentured servants were people who signed a contract, and that's called an indenture. So that's why they were indentured. And the term servant, as I mentioned briefly before we got started, is really not applicable. They were not servants. They were not in the sense of servants at all. They were people who have mandatorily worked at a certain occupation for no pay. The advantage to the people who owned the contract was that these people were, in a sense, they were not slaves in the actual sense, but they were enslaved people in the economic sense, meaning they got nothing for their labor. And sometimes they received something that was of value to them, such as receiving passage from a place to America, like from England or another country to America, or payment for a debt or a service or something else that they owed. And they were different than the people who came because they were not indentured, but because they were convicted of criminal offenses as minor as the proverbial stealing a loaf of bread. Well, they didn't even have to go so far as stealing a loaf of bread to be arrested and uh, and convicted and then transported to either Australia or some other place from England. And we'll focus a little bit on England because that was a common place where these indentures came from. And then the question is, what happened? Well, in Australia, the people now celebrate the fact that many of their ancestors were convicted, were convicts, and sent there forcibly. We in the United States have simply denied that entire culture when, as you'll find out as we go along here, that there were at least as significant a number of indentured, enslaved, and transported people. When we talk about the transported category, that's the ones that have been convicted of some crime. So this is the reality of this. And this is why this has such a tremendous impact on American history going back to the colonies because of the sheer numbers of all European immigrants. That means everybody who came from Europe to the 13 colonies before 1775, meaning just up until right before the Revolutionary War, half to two-thirds arrived as indentured servants. Now, that estimate is considered to be low. And most of the estimates that I see from knowledgeable sources of historical records, not people making stuff up, run as high as 80% of the white migrants to the colonies came as indentured servants. And they came either as redemptioners to redeem themselves from some debt, or they came as convicts. And so what does that have to do with how things were handled in America? We're going to call it America, the American colonies. So we'll get into that, and that's what we're going to do. So here's the first thing to understand. During that colonial period and after, that meant that only 10% or to the most 20% of the population could vote. Women could not vote, indentured servants, enslaved people, and the convicts could not vote. So here's the vast majority of the people, and the only people who could end up voting were the landowners and the people who actually owned the indentures or had the contract on the convicted person. So it's not surprising that as you work back in your genealogy, if your genealogy comes from the colonies, that at some point in time you're going to find that your person just appears in a magic fashion in America. There doesn't seem to be any record at all of this person arriving, doing anything, because those records are not records that we have generally had available as genealogical researchers. Today, it's possible. So we're going to be talking about a situation where it really is a dead end. In other words, those people who came were often young. They often did not understand the consequences of what was happening to them. They had no idea what it meant that they would be put into this indentured contract for up to 7 years, or maybe even longer. And the expectations, if any, that were given to them in England or wherever they were coming from were often very false. Not exactly what they might have been told that they were coming to learn blacksmithy. When they got to America, they found out that their indenture was simply a another item of commercial transfer, and that they could have that indenture could be sold to anyone who wanted to pay the price. And once they owned the indenture, they owned that person for the term of the indenture. And so this is kind of the situation that they're running into. Now, if the consideration was free passage to the designated location, all of that meant that they had received something in exchange for their agreement to come to America or to get into this indenture. And therefore, it was enforceable at law. And so here's a reward being offered for a couple of indentured servants who have left their indentures and are now on the lam trying to avoid getting arrested and returned. And the term could, and of course, if they leave and violate the conditions of their indenture, then the possibility is that they could have the indenture increased for an indefinite period of time or whatever might happen because of that. And understanding that the indenture itself, now when we talk about the indenture, we're talking about the legal document that creates this relationship. And so this document becomes like a mortgage. The documents could be sold or assigned to a piece of property. So the indenture itself has value. And so there was a market for them. And the broker in, say, in England, the broker in England would, through whatever means, would gather indentures from a number of young people, male and female, and then would have this huge packet of indentures. They'd ship them across the ocean, and those that didn't die in being transported over to America were then available here on an American, and they would simply hold an auction for the indentured servants. And the indenture would then be purchased, and whoever they purchased, had the complete control over that individual. Now, there was always a shortage of labor, a labor shortage in the American colonies and all the colonies. There was never enough people to do all the work that needed to be done during that time period. There were things most of that work involved heavy manual labor, cutting down trees, plowing fields, doing the things that need to be done in order to survive. And so basically, another thing is that the employers here, the landowners in the American continent, would offer to pay the way of any indentures. So they're going to put over there. In this case, you can almost make out where they can get many tradesmen. They're looking for blacksmiths, shoemakers, tailors, whatever, joiners, and they're not without the difficulty of not emphasizing the difficulty of what they're asking. In other words, yes, we'd like you to come, but we're going to tell you that you're going to be, in a sense, required to serve for the entire period of the indenture. And you may or may not get paid anything at the end, even if there was a contract that said you would get X number of dollars or X number of suit of clothes and a bag of food instead of whatever else. So in a sense, it was the indentures in some cases were self-perpetuating, because the indentured servant would get to the end of the indenture, they would have no resources. All they did was face going out and trying to find a job. Maybe they learned a trade, maybe they did not learn a trade. But if they did learn a trade, they could possibly survive. On the other hand, they could just sign another indenture and extend the indenture for another 7 years. Okay. Now, contrary to the enslavement, an enslavement was for life, and it was inheritable, meaning the children of an enslaved person were automatically slaves. There was no question as to whether or not they were slaves. They were slaves, enslaved people. And at the end of the term, the servant was freed from the servitude and could get what they're called freedom dues. And it just depended. The colonies, sometimes they get clothes, money, or tools. Sometimes they got land, and sometimes they sold what they got. In other words, they got land, but then they turned around and sold it so they could have enough money and they'd go to some place where they really wanted to have some land. So this is where it comes from. Now, the former indentured servants may have gotten fairly wealthy after a while. There was still plenty of opportunity as long as they could have access to some land or access to a trade. There was nothing that kept them from becoming a prosperous person, a member of the society, and a landowner, and therefore being able to vote and all the rest of the stuff that goes with being here. So you may find that this ancestor that you're tracing back to owned a bunch of property, was very fairly wealthy, but still has no origin, nothing. So that's kind of the situation where we find ourselves looking at this indenture situation. So the process of picking these people up in England was not what you would call had any kind of scruples. It was totally terrible. Misrepresentation about what was happening. These were generally speaking, as they talk about it, is they were indentures were between the age of 14 up to say 25 or 30. And depending on their condition, many of them were illiterate. It is not surprising that most of this huge number of indentured servants, were unable to remember who they were. Maybe they had no contact with the family. These were people that were picked up off the streets. They were runaways. They were all sorts of people that fell into this category. So it's not surprising that as you go back in time and you hit one of these people, that there becomes a suspicion. This guy must have been or lady must have been an indentured servant. And if they were, then we've got to be able to, can we determine the indenture? In other words, there's a question there. Can we really get out into the records and find these people? And as I've mentioned, in Maryland and in many other of the other colonies, those records may show up in the probate records, along with whatever court it is in whatever colony. In Maryland, it's called the Orphans Court, and in those court records. Now, we were in the process when I mentioned that at the beginning that we were digitizing records out of the Maryland State Archives. We had four cameras running, and a fifth set of missionaries that were there to prepare the documents for digitization, which was a manual process, assisted by about 30 different volunteers from the genealogical community there in Maryland. So basically, it was a big process, but I just think we just made a sort of a dent, a little dent in the number of documents that are available. So many of these documents that we would be using that would possibly show the condition of indenture are documents that are still sitting in archives and libraries and museums and special collections libraries around usually the eastern part of the country. And understanding that these indentured issues became, they say, they turned into wholesale. One example this is too big of a broad of a topic to cover in an hour, but one mention of a broad part of it is Georgia head rights. And in Georgia, the colony, land was exchanged on the basis of how many of these indentured servants that you could acquire. So if you could get a certain number of indentured servants, you would get the equivalent, what was ever equivalent in that, of land from Georgia to work your land. So in other words, you could trade purchasing indentured contracts or obtaining indentured contracts into land. And that's the kinds of things that were happening. And now we're going to get into some words. I don't have any. One of the difficulties in this particular presentation was coming up with images. There just isn't much. Indentured servitude was for both white and black. There's no, it had nothing to do with race in the sense of whether there were indentures or not indentures. And as I mentioned, at the end of the Civil War, we watched that process happening in the records that we were processing, where the black individuals were the younger children usually. And we saw indentures for infants signed by the guardian parent of a child. They would sign an indenture on what we would consider to be babies. And that was not uncommon. Initially, it was the dominant labor system in the whole area of the colonies. And as it says here down at the bottom, that the prices went up and down. There was like a stock market for the indenture. There was an indenture market. And the indenture market went up as demand increased and the supply decreased. The value and prices of the indentures went up. And as people came in and there were more indentures than were people willing to purchase those contracts, then the price of the indentures went down. And even at the end of the indenture, the indentured person may not even been in good health or sound body or couldn't even survive. So there's nothing to say that they couldn't work them to death in a sense. So this is just a couple of other facts that give you some perspective on how this worked across the whole spectrum of America. The mayors of London, Liverpool and London were the two major population centers in England during this early time. And they would just go in and sweep the cities and send them all to America as indentured servants. And of course, they got their cut from the contracts and all of that kind of thing. So there was, there's some basis for the process. It wasn't they were thinking, oh, we just need to help these poor, unfortunate children on the street to have some place to go and something to do. They just didn't want to deal with it. And so they would just herd them into groups, make a contract arrangement with a broker, and the broker would then take the contracts, and usually there would be some money moving back and forth. However, unlike indentured servants who were voluntarily entered into a contract and received, okay, there were those who could negotiate for it. If they had a specific specialty, let's say they were a blacksmith or they were somebody who could work with the farm animals, or if somebody had some skills, if they had skills, then in a sense they could sell those skills in trade for the indentured contract, and those theoretically might work out much better because if there was an incentive at the other end of the deal in America, that when this person who had the skills came to America, that they would then have a place to work and they would increase in their skills, and at the end of their indenture they could have done quite well. And this is the same with any of the ones that had that came to America with that kind of background. And it says that these people who had a contract, who voluntarily entered in, they were cheaper. They were cheaper than the ones that they picked up off the street. Now, if we don't want to, and I emphasize this, we don't want to just think about England. Of course, we do primarily because that's where some of us run into it. But Sweden sent political prisoners to New Sweden, now called Delaware. The Dutch sent vagrants and criminals to New York. The French transported criminals to New France. England sent vanquished political foes from Scotland and England, as well as people that they didn't like. People, if they didn't like your religion, one of the options was they would put you in, pick you up off the street and ship you off to America as an indentured servant. So it's true that some of the people who were convicted of felonies escaped the sentence of death when they were sentenced to transportation. It didn't really help England to kill these people off. It basically helped them to send them to America where there was the chronic labor shortage, and it solved two problems. And they got the criminals out of their country and off their streets and everything. And is what they were doing with these people. This is just kind of to reemphasize the fact that when they got here, it's not this really wonderful thing that they were a blacksmith in England and they got to come to America and then they paid their debt by working for the 7 years and then they became wealthy and happy. No, the problem is that that when they got to America, they were sold at an auction. And if the person looked like they were going to be a good laborer, they may not have had an opportunity to be a blacksmith. They may have been something else that they didn't particularly want to do. So it was just a matter of the demand and the supply as to what happened to the indentures. And also the indenture contract itself. These are contracts. They were theoretically enforceable by the purchaser, but they were also theoretically enforceable by the indentured person. So that's what happened. And this, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was not unusual for children, what we would consider children, under the age of 18, 17, 14, 12, 10, 9, and as I mentioned, down to babies who obviously had no understanding of what was going on. They were taken from wherever they were living in England or whatever country. They were put on a boat. They were shipped across the country, and then they were told that they worked for this person and had to be there, whatever they were asked to do in the form of work. So here's kind of a blow up of that. This is Georgia, Cherokee County. This indenture is made this 16th day of April 1866. So you can see this was still going on even after the intention part of it. As soon as there were enough people in America to justify shipping people over here, then they would, that's when it started. When it ended was when it no longer became economically worthwhile. In other words, the indentured part of it. It kind of morphed into people who became apprentices and which is an entirely different thing. That's not forced labor. An apprentice is somebody who learns a specific trade. But there were not as many reasons to have these as indentures as there were previously. And this is this one, if read clear through, is for a person and minor children. And as I mentioned, that many of the African Americans who at the end of slavery found that they had no work and no support were in a sense forced into indentures. So here's some more statistics, and I'm giving the sources for these statistics on the presentation. And what I do for the handout for the presentation is to get a PDF copy of the slides so you can get these references off here. It's fairly, I mean, straightforward to find information. Just go to, when you're doing searches online, is just look for indentured and indentured servants, and you'll find a lot of information, lots of responses. So here in the Chesapeake Bay colonies, Virginia and Maryland, between 1630 and 1680, that's 50 years of approximately 50,000 or about 1,000 a year servants. So three-quarters of all the new arrivals immigrated were indentures. And the Virginia census showed that 487 out of a total population of 1227 were indentured servants. That was early on in the 1620s to 25. That's way beginning back in the early days of Virginia. And by 1670, white indentured servants comprised 80% of Virginia's workforce. Okay, so these are just quotes. And these are the figures that are being used to understand this. Now, here's a direct example from my own line going back. And the percentages are going to affect the research directly. Okay, so we get back, we find as this time goes back, we have the most remote ancestor that we've been able to locate for sure, contrary to a lot of the stuff that's flying around on Family Search, by the way, but on the family tree. William Tanner appears around, estimated around 1683, and that's it. We don't have anything that shows. There's a rumor that he was a young boy in England who belonged to or was associated with a nonconformist religious group called the Seventh-day Baptists, and he was picked up on the street and brought to America. Well, if that was the case, then probably what happened was that he was sold as an indentured servant. And so he began the process, and we cannot find any connection records between him and anyone in England at this time. And this is somebody I've been personally off and on looking for this person for the last 43 years. So it's been a while. And now there is I suppose you could say there is a possibility with the full text search and the handwriting recognition, we have a much greater chance of being able to identify people like William Tanner. And so as we read the records that we have, it just seems more and more likely that he was an indentured servant at some point, because it just shows the record shows him just all of a sudden appearing with land and no visible or referential contact back to his place of origin. And I'm going to, make this as this is something you definitely need to consider, is that your end-of-line men and in some cases women in the 1600s and 1700s that have no record of that they're just not going to have a record of their origin outside of original indenture records. Now, here's the question. Do these original indenture records exist? As far as they were referenced in the courts, it's possible as time goes on and we get more court records and we get records like those we were looking at in Maryland, that those records will begin to show more consistently the indentures. But those would be indentures that were entered into in the Americas, in America. So they wouldn't necessarily tell us the origin of the person in wherever country they came from, primarily England. So Are there indentured records in England? Yes, there are some that exist. The problem is that in some cases, not even associated with the name of the person, because someone who is an indentured servant at the end of the indenture, in order to kind of get rid of the whatever problems there were, sociable problems in the society of being an indentured servant, could easily change their names. And they're no longer connected with the indenture, and they're no longer connected with England. It's another very common possibility. So by the time of the war, the Revolutionary War in 1775, they started to decrease greatly. Well, two or three things were happening. Land was becoming more and more available as they pushed off into the west, into Ohio and across the mountains into Kentucky and Tennessee and other places, and in Indiana and Illinois and all of the places west. And it was too easier to go west. And so because of that, the country more and more was relying on enslaved African labor. So instead of having an indentured servant that was going to disappear theoretically in 7 years, they put their enslaved laborers in that same position, and they were enslaved for life, and all of their children were slaves. So that was the issue. Now, if you want to get into the origins of the immigrant servants as to where they probably came from, I'm recommending this article by Nathan Murphy. I have the citation here for the article, and it'll be in the handout that I give out. And when you're watching one of these videos, you can always take screenshots. Stop the video and take a screenshot to get the information. It's pretty simple to do that also. Just pause the video, copy it out, or do a screenshot that you have that information. But Nathan Murphy is probably not a common genealogist, but he is one of the most outstanding genealogists in the country today in the United States. And this is a quote directly from Nathan. These men and women created few records while bound, and once they became free, records may not mention their previous status. Okay, that simple statement summarizes what I've been saying about the lack of availability of the records that might be available for these people. So now we're going to go through several kinds of records that could possibly contain the information that would be helpful to us in breaking through this barrier of the indenture coming from another country. So these indenture papers would specify the name of the servant, the length of the service, the destination and terms of their freedom. And the last statement is the most telling statement, and that is that not many of those that survived in the US through the indenture and were freed had no reason to keep the papers. There was no reason. The person who had the indenture, it was just at that point, was a worthless piece of paper. And for the indentured servant, it was a reminder of their indenture, which they may not have cared to have. Port registers. There's more of these records outside of what are generally considered to be genealogical records in the sense that they're on the major genealogical websites than there are on the websites. In other words, these are records that pop up across many different places, and they're focused primarily in Bristol, London, Middlesex, the different places in England that where their ports were, and they were that these documents would have been being generated. They're considered to be legal documents, and so they may end up in some kinds of court records. They may be litigation over an indenture. meaning that somebody sued for their indenture contracts or whatever, and there could be others. So these examples include this record of set, the Bristol registers of servants sent to foreign plantations. In these cases here, my suggestion is just use this title as a search term, and this should get you into the records. And also there are London and Middlesex registers and local and county courthouse records. The indentured contracts, in order to make them more legal or enforceable, were often recorded, just like deeds are recorded. And so there are volumes of records from in different counties of that may contain long lists of numbers of these copies of these indentured records. And then there were probably there's a lot of court proceedings that went on. There may have been differences in the contracts between the broker and the buyer of the contract. There may have been issues about the terms of the indenture, and the indentured person may have raised some issues about the fact that what was in the document was not being enforced. And all of these things would generate court proceedings and legal issues. And we found them in the guardianship records because orphaned or abandoned children uh, could have been assigned guardians who then indentured the children for service or apprenticeship. And that actually is something that happened, at least frequent enough for us to notice it in working with probate records. And remember what I said earlier about orphan. The orphans were considered orphans when the father died. So if the father died with minor children, they were orphans. It didn't matter if the mother was still alive. And the court could assign a guardian who was not the mother, and they could sign the indenture for the children against the mother's wishes. Cases of misdeeds, they were, in many cases, prevented from having children during the indenture or getting married during the indenture or doing anything like that during the indenture. If they decided to take it out on their master of the owner of the indenture, they could have all come into court. So all those things might be there, and court records might very soon provide. And when I mean soon, that means when handwriting recognition gets through these court records, we may be able to find some of these instances. And wills and deeds, because they were property rights, if the master owner of the indenture died, then that would be inheritable by his or her heirs. Church records, they may have been put in a grave in the potter's fields in the place where people who had no assets were buried, and maybe their status could have been noted. So it's worth looking at church records. And for birth records, children may have been born to an indentured servant, and that was usually as a restriction. And their birth might be found in court records because there was an intervention of the court in those cases. Newspapers, runaway advertisements. We've put up a couple of them here. I put up a couple of them here in this presentation, but runaways had a complete description and sometimes their name. And the notice of the sale of remaining contract time might also appear. And there could also be on passenger lists. And you can cross-reference passenger lists with other records to come up with a possible identity for a person. That unfortunately, on passenger list, is going to tell you they left from Bristol or from wherever they left from in England, and they didn't tell you where they came from ultimately, whether they came from some other county in England or where. So here's some tips for research in this area, and that is first, you need to be, let's say, completely aware of the time period and location. Indentured servitude was prevalent during the 17th and 18th centuries, so in 1600s and 1700s. If you know the approximate date of arrival and the colonial destination, that will help you work. But when they get here, you need to know exactly where they were and identify that because of the same name problem. Many people with the same names. Check both sides of the Atlantic. You may have to do records not even knowing where they came from, but you may be doing records into classes of records like the ones that I just went through, the various types of records. Don't get hung up on spelling. As a fact is that spelling of surnames in the United States, in America, for example, and later in the United States, did not completely become more reliable until after about 1850. So once you go back in time and you hit the magic 1850, you can assume that your person's name's going to be spelled in lots of different ways. And so you may just simply be, you know, I've dealt with people who focused on the name and would not even believe the records when we found the person because they didn't spell their name the right way that they thought was the right way. And consider when they got their freedom dues. They may have got land and they may have gotten other things. And when they died, there may have been a probate, you're more likely to find this person in early records in the colonies, the American colonies, that from the time period from land and property records is what I'm trying to say. So, in other words, what you're going to be finding initially are going to be deeds and all of that. But those deeds, as when you start researching back in the deeds, may give you an insight into the fact that this person could have been an indentured party. He may have gotten the original property under a indenture contract. Apprenticeships versus indentures. Don't mistake these. These are not apprenticeships. These are not where a person becomes in a sense, bound employee. Apprenticeships generally were paid. Apprenticeships, in addition, had nothing to do with a specific time, but the acquisition of a certain degree of competency. And so an apprentice was a person that learned a trade directly, and the person to whom they were the apprentice for, the actual worker, didn't have that kind of control over their life. They were there for their apprenticeship. So here the key is to keep researching and keep learning. Learn about the records, learn about the trades, become familiar with the probate records and land and property records, particularly because this is where these people are going to pop up. And there's a lot more to learn, no matter how much you think you already know. As I learn each day, I am kind of painfully aware that I still am learning so of the amount of things that I still have no idea about. Okay, well, thanks for watching.